Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we'll talk about how we can use modules in a .NET 6 minimal API. If you have watched my other videos on the minimal API, I was telling this in each of the videos. One of the major benefits, in my opinion, for the minimal API is that it is less opinionated than the regular controller-based approach. And this in turn allows us or gives us more freedom to organize the code or our code in a way that we actually see fit. And this is why I think that here it's easier to really change a little bit the paradigm that we were normally using when developing APIs and usually when we were developing ASP.NET Core applications, and start to think about modules. Modules are, well, self-contained sets of features. So for instance, if you have an API where you have, I don't know, products, then you would have a products module. And you would put in all the endpoints that you need and everything that you need around those endpoints, like DTO, profiles for AutoMapper or other things you would then put actually at the same place. This is kind of like what Jimmy Bogart calls a vertical slices architecture, a concept that I think is very, very nice. And it also, of course, this approach with modules also plays well with the CQRS approach, where we use commands and queries and command handlers and query handlers and things similar to that. Now let's get started. And before we actually write some code, the one thing that is really important, I guess, is that it's very easy to create modules in a .NET 6 minimal API project, because there is a library that I have wrote. Actually, when I was doing some live coding sessions on the .NET 6 minimal APIs, we were using that approach of organizing our features in different modules. And those modules were actually also self-registering. So this is why I just extracted that part in a very small class library that is called SmartModules, and that allows us to very, very easily implement this idea of module just by inheriting one interface, and then everything will be wired up when we run the application. So there's nothing more that you would need to do. So let's get started and install SmartModules. Let me open NuGet Package Manager, and here in Browse, let's make sure that I choose the NuGet feed. And the package is actually called Code Wrinkles Minimal API Smart Modules. So Code Wrinkles, of course, is the name of the channel. That's the name that I usually use when doing stuff. And then Minimal API and Smart Modules, so that we are clear exactly what we mean by that. Now let's install this package. It's a very small one. It doesn't have any other dependency except, of course, .NET Core the version 6, which will come out just tomorrow, I guess, or at least by the time I record this video. And we are actually done now. So if we check our dependencies and our packages, we see that we have this Code Wrinkles Minimal API Smart Modules package, which is cool. So let's now get started with this template. We have here this regular template that we have in ASP.NET Core, which is a minimal API, and here is this part with the weather forecast. So let's, instead of having everything here wired up in this program.cs class, because you would assume in a regular API, if you map all your routes here, it will be, this file will get very, very, very long, very fast. And that is surely not optimal. So let's instead think about extracting all the features regarding a weather forecast in an own module. So let's get started. For that, we will add a new folder, and let's call this folder weather forecast module. And in this one, let's add a new class. And let's call this class weather forecast module. That would be okay. Good. So now let's just simply here inherit the IModule interface. This is the interface that we have in this package that we have installed. And this interface actually makes us implement a very, very small piece of code, which in this case, it's simply where we need to map our routes. Now, the only thing is that we have to return the endpoint route builder. So we will have here return app. And what we can do, of course, is if we go in the program.cs file, we can just simply take this part here, because this doesn't belong in the program class. This belongs in the weather forecast module, because this is the module that is dedicated to the weather forecast. And that would be it. Let's also maybe do it like that. And one other thing that we would need to do is also extract the summaries, and we can use, for instance, that's actually an approach that I would recommend, just nested classes, for instance, here for DTOs. In our case, well, we can consider this as a DTO. So this is our class. Let's have this weather forecast, and that would do it. And of course, we will also need a private field here, which we have here, of course. And for instance, in our module, we can just, for instance, before we actually do this, we can just also have this one declared here. Now, of course, this is not very well formatted right now, but if we, I don't know, let's get an edit advanced. I always forgot this shortcut, format document. That should be, oh, it's the same. Good. We won't care about it. So we have actually moved the entire weather forecast logic that we had previously in this program.cs file in our weather forecast module. And you see that we have already got rid of a lot of lines of code here in our program.cs file. It's already much, much cleaner than that. Now, the only thing that we would need to do here is we would add here once again to the services, because the SmartModules package has some services, and here SmartModules, here we would have use CodeWrinkle's minimal APIs, of course, that's the one. And similar to AutoMapper, we have to specify here a type in this current assembly where we should actually, or where SmartModules will look for your modules. So in this case, we will just provide the program, which and this means that SmartModules will scan our entire program or the entire assembly where this class is defined, and will register all the modules that it finds. Now, one other thing that we need to add is just here, simply also we need to add all the routing and some very, very basic middleware. So in this case, we will have use SmartModules, and that's it, nothing else. That should be it. So right now, if we let's build this solution and let's run the API, and theoretically it should do exactly the same thing. The only difference is that we kind of moved all the weather forecast functionality in its own module. So right now we have really a functionality that is self-contained into one single module. Of course, this doesn't mean necessarily it needs to be one file. So if we run a get here, let's try it out. And I would assume, you see, everything's working, Swagger is working, and we already have a modular API. Now, I want to go one step further with you, because we have here right now this weather forecast module. But once again, and here you can then register all your routes that you need for that module. Now, it could be, or in most cases, you would have in normal APIs also resources that are very, very complicated and nested. So this concept of nested resources, or maybe even deeply nested resources. So this idea of modules would probably then bring a lot of code here in our map endpoints definitions method. Practically, we would move a lot of things that we previously had in this program.cs class in this module. Now, one thing that we can do is, if we are in such scenarios, we can even split the different endpoint registrations into different endpoint definitions classes. And let's see how this is done. Let's add here a new class, and let's call this class weather forecast endpoint definition. So this would be an endpoint definition class. And in order for it to be an endpoint definition, we just need to implement this interface endpoint definition that is also part of the SmartModules package. One important thing about this interface is that it is actually only a marker interface. So it actually doesn't make you implement a certain method. And the reason why it is like that is because we just want to give the freedom for you as a developer to define or design the way that you want to register your modules or your endpoints really in a way that you would see fit. Now, what we can do here, for instance, is let's create a method public, and this method would return an I endpoint route builder map endpoints. Let's also spell it correctly. That should be okay. Now, what we can do here in this map endpoints, for instance, we can take this one and actually move this into the endpoints definition. So let's also cut this out. We'll also need to move the record. So let us have here this one first. But here, of course, we need to also get an I endpoint route builder, and let's call this app to be consistent. And let's also move this out from the module, this internal record. We don't need it here anymore. We'll move it in the definition. And here in the definition, where do we have? This is the class. Okay, so let's just in the same namespace, just also move this class, and we will be good to go. So right now we have this endpoint routing definition. And you can imagine that in this module, you could actually have, for instance, a route definition, for instance, for all your get methods. You could have a route definition for all your post methods. You could have a route definition for all your put methods. So you see, you have here the total freedom to actually organize the definitions in a way that makes sense and that has a very logical aspect to it, or to your application, or it is in the logic of your application how you actually can do this. Now, right now, what we would need to do is actually get an instance of this endpoint definition here in our module class, and then use that instance to execute that method that would register the endpoints. So it's nothing easier than that, because what SmartModule also does, it actually maps or adds all your modules and your endpoint definitions to the DI container. So this means that we could have here a private read-only field, which would be of weather forecast endpoint definition. Let's just call it definition. And then in a constructor, we can have here, for instance, just let's have this constructor here. And in this constructor, we could get, once again, weather forecast definition. And here we could have definition equals definition. Sorry for all the bad formatting. I'm not sure exactly why this happens right now. Let's also just remove here a space. And what we could do here in this map endpoints definition is just use our definition and then map endpoints and provide the app, and then of course return the app. See, and right now our module is very, very clean. We have moved that code in the endpoint definition, and you could imagine for very, very complex module with a lot of endpoints, you can group different endpoints, as said, in different weather or in different endpoint definition classes. And then in this module, you would keep it also very clean, because you would just have to insert your definitions and then run them or execute the methods that you would create in order to map endpoints. And if we run the application, it should sorry, we have here one problem. Of course, we have forgotten a semicolon somewhere, and it is here. Good. Let's run it again, and this time I would expect it to work, and it should work as we have said previously. Let's run it. Let's try it out. I assume it would work. execute, and we really got the weather forecast. So everything is cool. Now, there is one other thing that I would like to show you and discuss with you regarding this SmartModules library, because it's also very, very nice that you could, for instance, inject the services that you need in each module, for instance. So you could here have a private read-only iLogger of, let's call this weather forecast module, and let's have this logger, which would be okay. We will also need the iLogger here, iLogger of weather forecast module, and we'll call it logger. Okay, and we'll then just assign it here. Good. So right now we see that we have injected our service. So let's run it again. And right now when we do the, of course we also need to log something. Sorry for that. Let's log something. Logger.log information, and here in this information, registering, of course it needs to be a string, registering endpoint definitions for weather forecast module. Good. So right now, if we run this application, once again, we should be able to also see something here in this console. And in this case, you see we have registering these endpoint definitions. So we are able to use the logger. Now, this means that all the modules that you create and all your endpoint definitions are totally wired up with your dependency injection container. So this means that you can inject here any service that you want. However, there is one small catch here. If you would need, for instance, scoped services in these modules, then you would have to inject them or create them using the iService scope factory. And the reason for that is that actually when we create these modules, we have to actually create them when the application starts, because we have to register the routes. So this means that if we would add all the services, for instance, that are in SmartModules as scope services, that would mean that their scope would be equal to the lifetime of the application, because those modules are registered once and live then until the application shuts down. So even if we would have used by default scope services here, they would have behaved exactly like singleton services, which is not okay. So in this case, if you need scope services here, like for instance, if you're using the DB contest, that's actually very, very easy to achieve. And it's actually the same thing that you would actually do, for instance, in a background service, or when you want to inject a scope service into a transient or singleton service. And let's try to inject this logger as scope. So instead of iLogger, what I would like to have here is iService provider. Let's have this. I'm doing a lot of typos today. So we would have a provider, and here, for instance, what we would do is we have here an iService provider. So instead of the logger, we just use the provider, and we will create then a separate logger for that. And the way you would use this is actually that where you actually need to perform something with the scope service, the only thing you would need to do is, for instance, using var scope equals, how did you call this, provider, and here create scope. And that would create a scope, and once you have a scope, you can actually use it to resolve the service that you need. So we can say here then var logger equals scope service provider get required service. And here we say that this required service should be an iLogger type weather forecast module. And right now, this logger will behave as scoped. So if you have DB contexts or services that need to be injected as scoped, the only thing is that in these modules, you would have to inject them via this service provider and create a scope for them. And everything should actually work as it did before. So if we run the application, we will just see here that registering endpoints for module definition. The only difference is that right now, instead of injecting directly directly the logger, we have injected the iService provider and we have created a scope, and in that scope we have then resolved this logger service with which we have logged. So this is exactly like you would do with regular scope services that you would need to use in your modules or endpoints definitions, because everything that we have done here in this module, you could equally do here on this weather forecast endpoint definition class. You can just add the constructor, you can just add the fields that you need, and then inject all the services that you need in that constructor, well, then map them to the fields that you have created. So it's exactly the same, which means that you can easily use this type of modules then also with all the services that you already have in your DI container. And that's actually it on how you can get started with smart modules in a .NET 6 minimal API. As I said, I see that it's very, very nice because it actually offers you the opportunity and the freedom to go for a slightly different architectural pattern than we were usually used when developing API. And in .NET 6, and specifically with this Smart Modules library, it's actually easier than ever to get started with that. Just to give you an example, once we are here in this weather forecast module, we could, for instance, have here a folder for comments, and here we would have all comments for this weather forecast module. The same way we could have here a folder for queries, and then we will have here all the queries for this weather forecast module. And then we could have here a folder for handlers, and here we would have all the handlers for this module. Then we could actually have a folder for profiles, and here we would have all our automapper profiles for the DTO classes. So you see that in this case, everything is self-contained actually to one single place in your application where all the code regarding a certain module resides. This is actually, or this makes your app easier to maintain, because if you have bugs or need to do things, you already know exactly that if there is a problem with the weather forecast, then of course the problem is somewhere here in this weather forecast module, and therefore in the weather forecast module folder, and that would be it. Okay, as I said, that would be it. This is a library that it's actually a very small one, as I said, but I think it's very powerful, and it gives us a lot of opportunities to work with to design the code in our APIs or the architecture of our APIs differently. But so this being said, if you have feedback, there is the GitHub repository for this library, and I will provide a link in the description of this video. Don't be shy and raise issues there, raise questions. If you would like to see more features in this Smart Modules package, then just let me know via these issues or write a comment here. That would be great, because I have a few ideas on how I could make this library even better, or what functionality I could continue to add. But it's always important, if somebody uses this library, to just also tell, okay, what would be needed, what else would be needed in order for this library to bring you a lot of value. So this time I would ask you that instead of, well, commenting here, just go to the GitHub page of this package and open an issue if you have a question, or if you want a certain functionality, or if you want to contribute. Just get in touch with me and we'll see exactly how we can do this, because I don't really want to work on this library only by my own. So if you want to join this effort, that would be great. So just let me know. That would be very, very important. This being said, thank you very, very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.